In 2016, one pitcher led all of Major League Baseball in earned run average. His fastball averaged 88 miles per hour. That number alone should have been disqualifying. In a league where the average starter's fastball sat around 92 to 93 miles per hour, an 88-mile-per-hour fastball was not just below average, it was near the bottom of every qualified starting pitcher in baseball. And yet Kyle Hendricks finished that season with a 2.13 ERA, the lowest mark of anyone in either league. Mites, lower than Clayton Kershaw, lower than every flame-throwing ace in the sport. That same season, Hendricks threw the final game of the World Series for the Chicago Cubs, the franchise's first championship in over a century. The pitcher on the mound for the biggest moment in franchise history was not the hardest thrower on the roster. He was the one with the fastball that, on paper, looked the least like a championship-caliber arm. For most of his career up to that point, scouts had already decided what kind of pitcher Hendricks was going to be. In the minor leagues, velocity was the first number anyone looked at on a scouting report. It was the easiest thing to measure, the easiest thing to compare across players, and for decades it had been treated as the closest thing to a ceiling. A pitcher who threw in the upper 90s had a high ceiling, even if his control was shaky. A pitcher who threw 88, even with good command, was typically projected as a back-end starter at best, or a long reliever, someone who would survive in the majors rather than dominate it. Radar guns were cheap, simple, and instant. Anything that could not be reduced to a single number on a stopwatch tended to get pushed to the margins of a scouting report, treated as a tiebreaker rather than a primary tool. Hendricks fit that second profile almost exactly. Polished, athletic, good control, but without the raw arm strength that usually defines a future ace. On paper, his ceiling looked modest before he ever threw a pitch in the big leagues. Then his results stopped matching the projection. By 2016, Hendricks was not just performing well, he was performing at a level that velocity-based models could not explain. His ERA was elite. His ability to get outs against hitters with far more raw power than his fastball suggested he should be able to handle was elite. Analysts started asking a simple question. If velocity was supposed to be the ceiling, how was a pitcher this far below average producing results this far above it? If you have ever watched a pitcher with modest velocity completely shut down a lineup full of power hitters and wondered how that is even possible, that question is exactly what this channel exists to dig into. The answer started to take shape around the same time through a body of research that had nothing to do with how hard a pitch was thrown, and everything to do with how it looked on the way there. Analysts at Baseball Prospectus began studying something called pitch tunneling. The idea was built around a single point in every pitch's flight, located roughly 23 to 24 feet in front of home plate. The spot where a hitter has to commit to a swing because there is no longer enough time to react to anything that happens after that point. Researchers started measuring how close together two different pitch types were at that exact location, in terms of trajectory, location, and arm angle. Even though their final destinations and speeds could be completely different, the measurement itself was straightforward in concept, but required tracking data that had only recently become available across every major league ballpark. For each pitch, researchers could now plot the exact three-dimensional path from release to home plate, frame by frame. By comparing two pitch types thrown from the same arm slot, they could calculate how far apart those paths were at the commitment point, often measured in fractions of an inch, and how far apart they ended up by the time the ball crossed the plate, often measured in feet. A large gap between those two numbers meant a pitcher was hiding one pitch inside another almost perfectly. When they ran the numbers on Hendricks, the results stood out immediately. His sinker and his changeup left his hand on nearly identical paths. To a hitter standing 60 feet and 6 inches away, the two pitches looked the same for most of their flight, They arrived at that commitment point at almost the same location, traveling at what appeared to be almost the same speed. Only after that point did they separate, the changeup losing several more miles per hour and dropping more sharply than the sinker that had looked just like it a split second earlier. By the time a hitter realized which pitch was coming, it was already too late to adjust. This is what tunneling actually does. It does not make a pitch faster in any way a radar gun can measure. It changes how much time a hitter effectively has to recognize and react to it. A fastball that looks identical to a changeup until the last possible moment behaves. From the hitter's perspective, like a faster pitch than its velocity alone would suggest, because the decision window has been compressed. Hendricks was not overpowering hitters with raw stuff. He was overpowering their ability to tell two pitches apart until it no longer mattered. When Baseball Prospectus ranked pitchers by tunneling metrics, Hendricks was consistently near the top of the league, often ahead of pitchers with far better raw velocity. His command played a role too. Throwing two pitches on the same path requires extreme consistency in release point, something that had always shown up as good control on a traditional scouting report, but had never been measured as part of deception before. Hendricks himself had earned the nickname The Professor years before any of this research existed, a name given to him for the way he approached pitching like a problem to be solved rather than a contest of force. What the tunneling data did was give that nickname a mechanism. The professor label had always been a description of style. Tunneling research turned it into something that could be measured, ranked, and compared against every other pitcher in the league. What this meant for evaluation was significant. A pitcher's ceiling had always been treated as something closely tied to the upper limit of his velocity. Tunneling research suggested that deception could function almost like a second axis entirely. One that could take a below-average fastball and make it play like an above-average one, simply by hiding it next to a pitch that looked identical until the last instant. For Hendricks specifically, this reframed his entire profile. He was not a finesse pitcher overachieving despite his stuff. By the metric that mattered most for the outcome of a pitch, the amount of time a hitter actually had to react, his stuff was playing far closer to elite than his radar gun readings ever suggested. The ceiling that scouts had capped based on velocity turned out to be measuring the wrong thing. The broader impact reached beyond Hendricks. Once tunneling became part of how teams evaluated pitchers, players who had been undervalued for the same reason, modest velocity paired with strong command and consistent release points, started getting a second look. Front offices began searching for the next Hendricks, pitchers whose true ceiling had been hidden behind a single number that had never told the whole story. Pitching coaches began designing changeups and sinkers specifically to share a release point and an early trajectory with a pitcher's fastball, building tunnels on purpose instead of discovering them after the fact. The velocity number said Hendricks belonged near the bottom of the league. The tunneling data said something else entirely. And once that gap became visible, it changed how an entire generation of pitchers would be evaluated. Not by how hard they threw, but by how well they could hide it.